Okay, let's continue with hierarchical clustering. So far we've seen partitioning clustering, and we observed that there were three important limitations whenever the data samples were or had different sizes, different densities, irregular shapes. K-means couldn't cope at all with this type of scenarios. So let's see how hierarchical clustering and other approaches that we'll see in this class might help with that. When we talk about hierarchical clustering, there are two approaches, agglomerative and divisive approaches. We're going to focus on agglomerative, which are the most popular, but if you understand agglomerative, divisive is basically the opposite, or doing the same thing in the opposite direction. So when we talk about agglomerative clustering, it's pretty straightforward, right? Initially what we assume is that each single object in our data set is a cluster. Okay, so on the x-axis I'm representing time or steps, right? So we start with a step 0. Imagine that we have 5 different samples from A to E. We assume that all those samples are a cluster in themselves. And then basically in an iterative process, we start merging clusters together until all objects have been merged into a single cluster. Now, how we merge those clusters together is something that we'll see how it's actually done and computed. But the important thing here is that the process is done all the way until all the objects are merged into a single cluster. And then on the other hand, divisive clustering is exactly the opposite. So in divisive clustering, step 0 assumes that all the objects are initially in one unique cluster, and then basically what we do is that we start dividing that unique cluster into multiple or smaller clusters until we reach the point in which each single point is a unique cluster in itself. So it's exactly, as you can see, exactly the same idea. But the previous one was a bottom-up approach, and this one is a top-down approach. Okay? But the issue is exactly the same. When do we decide how to put together two clusters or how to separate data points into clusters? That's one thing that we have to figure out. And then obviously we're going to do it all the way down until the points are individual clusters, or all the way down until all the points are in one cluster. How do we decide the ideal number of clusters? Those are the two things that we're going to be looking into. Before we do that, dendrograms are really important and useful when we talk about hierarchical clustering, because it basically shows how the different clusters are created, or how the different samples are put together and separated. So each node on the tree is a cluster, and basically each leaf is a singleton cluster. So the red dots that you see there are the individual data points that we have. And as you keep on moving upwards on the tree, each blue square is going to represent a cluster. Okay, and basically each blue square, if we are thinking about the agglomerative approach, each blue square is created as we keep on putting together different data points in our original data set. And obviously, whenever we reach the root node, that means that all the data points are in one cluster. In order to decide how many clusters we want, or what's an ideal or a good number of clusters, basically what we do is that we cut the dendrogram at the desired level, right? So imagine that we want to have two different clusters, like k equals 2, right? So we want two clusters. We basically put the cutting line on the dendrogram below the root node, because we know that the root node is branching out onto two other trees. So we basically put the cutting line there, and we end up with two different trees corresponding to each of the branches from the root node, right? Left branch with 3 data samples in this case, and right branch with 6 data samples in this case. We could obviously move the cutting line below the root node, and so we would be obtaining 3, 4, and so on clusters. Okay. How do we execute more formally? What's the algorithm to execute agglomerative clustering? Which is, again, the most popular technique. As I was saying, we're just going to explain agglomerative. Divisive is exactly the same thing, but the opposite way. So it's pretty straightforward, right? We're going to start computing the distance matrix. And by distance, what I mean is exactly what I was saying before, right? If we are going to bring together data points that are originally a cluster and we want to bring them together, the idea is that we will merge together the clusters that are closer. Okay, so we need a definition of distance. If we are merging together clusters that are closer, we need to define distance. So basically, we compute a distance matrix for each individual point in our data set. Okay, what's the distance between points? Because again, we start with each point being a cluster. And then we start an iterative process in such a way that we are going to be merging clusters that are closest and updating the distance matrix until we just end up with one unique cluster. And as I was saying before, the important thing here and what distinguishes different agglomerative clustering approaches is on the way we define that distance. So let's look to an example. As I was saying before, imagine that we have all the data points on the left-hand side, and we define a distance matrix that basically, each cell represents what's the distance between each individual point in our data set. Again, these points are assumed to be individual clusters. After some merging steps, let's imagine that we know how the merging steps work, we end up with these 5 different clusters. Right hand side we see the distance matrix, and bottom right we see the distribution of the points and the clusters, right? So what you see there is basically P1 and P2 are part of one cluster, P3 and P4 are part of another cluster, we have P8 and P9 that are part of another cluster, P10, 11 and 12 are part of another cluster. That's the dendrogram distribution, right? So we need to compute the distance between all the clusters and then basically merge the ones that are closest. Right? So what we want to do is imagine that, distance we are considering just separation between the clusters. In this case,
C2 and C5
are the closest clusters. So what we do, if you look at the distance matrix, we take C2 and C5 and we need to update it in such a way that these two will now be just one unique cluster. And then on the dendrogram representation, you see that what we would need to do is basically put together, if you see that there's this new line appearing, this is the old one, this is the new one, the new line appearing, putting together clusters 2 and 5, okay? So basically, we are just creating here a unique cluster out of these two. And then basically in the distance matrix, what we are doing is now we have a unique column that represents both cluster 2 and cluster 5, okay? And now what we need to do is basically compute the distance between this new cluster and all the other clusters that we have. And in the dendrogram, you see the dendrogram updated, and now we have just 4 clusters instead of 5. How do we compute the distance? How do we keep, updating the distances between the different clusters? There are many different types of measures that we could use, okay? Like minimum distance, maximum distance, group average. So let's look some of the definitions, right? Mean distance basically represents what's the minimum distance between the closest pair of points that belong to different clusters, right? So if you're considering of merging cluster 2 and 5, as we were considering, we take the 2 points that are the closest and we compute the distance. Max is the distance of the farthest points that belong to different clusters. Group average is just you take all the possible pairs of points that belong to different clusters and compute the average distance. And centroid distance, you compute the distance between the centroids of the clusters that you are hypothetically trying to understand whether they should be merged or not. Right? So then, these type of distances are the ones that we apply to the table here, like here, for example, right? And then we basically would be like, okay, so what's the distance between C1 and the new C2 union C5? What's the distance between C3 and C2 union C5, and so on? And we could be looking into, the closest points or the farthest away points, okay, depending on the type of distance measure that we decide to use. The interesting thing about agglomerative clustering is that we do not have to assume any particular number of clusters. In fact, we build the clustering approach all the way up, okay, bottom up, until we have all the points being part of a unique cluster. And then what we do is that we need to play around with the cutting of the dendrogram, okay? So, it's fair to say that there's no number of clusters to consider in the clustering approach. However, there's a K that needs to be defined as a cutting of the dendrogram. And so it's also hard to define, that cutting line, right? Because, there's no function that needs to be minimized or anything. So basically the way this is typically done is that, you look at different cutting points and you decide whether the points that you have in the resulting clusters make sense or not, right? I mean, do they, the labels that we could assign, do they appear to have, a decent meaning or an understandable meaning or not?